Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Christina Hefferan, and this is Chan Ye. The Architect as Developer panel is an annual conference hosted by the GSD's Real Estate Development Club, and we'd like to thank the Red Club as well as the Practice Platform and Career Services for sponsoring tonight's panel. Again, we're so grateful you joined us tonight, and we also invite you, while you're here, to check out the Harvard 2019 Real Estate Weekend, which will be held March 9th and 10th. This is a joint venture between the GSD and HBS, so if you're interested in a career in real estate, definitely check it out. In addition, there are also tickets for a discounted student rate, so just FYI. And tonight we want to introduce our moderator, James Petty. James is a graduate of the Yale School of Architecture. He is the author of Architect and Developer, A Guide to Creating Your Own Projects. He's also an architect at Gluck Plus, an architecture, development, and construction studio in New York City. The founder of Postscript as well, Postscript Studio, which is a collaborative practice with the eponymous to rethink professional practice of architecture. And now we welcome James, and we're very grateful for you to be here tonight.
So my name is James, and I'm here with Jonathan of OJT, Macy of MSL, AJ from Alloy, and Rob from Hybrid Arc. And so we're going to talk about Architect as Developer. As I mentioned, I wrote a book called Architect and Developer. I run a website and an Instagram to try to profile a lot of these guys and give some interviews from different architects and developers around the nation. Just anytime I find some new people, really try to expose them. The entire idea of this isn't new, it's not novel. 240 years ago, John Nash, an architect, wanted to start out his own firm, so he took a lease assignment in London on a piece of property, developed 8 units, and sold them. You later know him as the architect for Buckingham Palace. So how do you start this? That's the first question people ask. The first thing you got to do is make yourself smart. Obviously, you guys are at the GSD or MIT, so you're doing a good job at that. But in a nutshell, you have to figure out what you want to do. You figure out how you're going to finance it. You got to lock up a site, organize your financing, close on a site, get a contractor, and go make money. It's that simple. This is a diagram that Place Taylor put together. They're a local firm that also does development. But when you sell it, your loan gets paid back, and the investors you have get paid back, and you get to make whatever's left over, if there's anything left over. And that's the whole idea of risk. That's what a lot of people understand here. So an architect and developer, as a developer, most people understand that there are clear risks. There's a clear upside and a downside. What you forget is that as an architect, there's also a lot of downsides that your PL insurance alone isn't going to help you from. You may not even get paid. You may not get paid on time from the client. It's some bad stuff. At the same time, your fee is a fixed fee, not fun. So the idea of the architect and developer is to sort of combine these professions to make a more efficient system and to align interests. And what you'll also find in a lot of this research with Alloy, with Hybrid, and a lot of others, Plus, is that you start to combine the contractor as well to help reduce your risk and align interest across all spectrums and try to get rid of all of the litigation and all the bullshit that has to do with architecture and construction in general. So I just want to go through some quick strategies that a lot of people are doing around from small to large, from very small spectrum. It's a couple in Barcelona that lost all their clients in 2008, so they sold their apartment, they bought a couple of new ones, they fixed them up, they sold them. They realized they like doing that better than actually having clients, so now that's all they do. Jose de la Cruz down in Houston, he took out money from his 401k, borrowed some money from his brother, bought a house for $80,000, put $80,000 into it, sold it for $280,000. The entire time he was working for Gensler. So Gensler from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. On Saturday and Sunday, he fixed up this house, made more money on the house. You can do single family. This is Mike Benkert in Cincinnati. He also has a full-time job, and he, on the side, he went out and found a piece of land for $25,000 in a sheriff's sale, bought it, got a contractor, and works his 9 to 5 job Monday through Friday. And during his lunch break, comes and checks on his contractor who's building his site. But he needs to keep his job because that's how he gets his financing. Bank needs to know they're going to get their money back. They need to have that guarantor. So that's what his job does while he's doing this on the side. You can use it as a billboard. So this is the Up Studio. They were a small new office in New York. They were only doing interior renovations and not so fun work. They wanted to do a new build modern house. No one was going to hire them to do that. So what they did was they bought a piece of land. They built a house. While this was under construction, several people came by and said, "Guys, this is a great house. Will you design one for me?" And now they have a lot of clients. They're having no problem getting work anymore, and they're a full-fledged firm. So it's using development as creating a billboard just to start a firm. So what a lot of these guys are doing is a lot bigger work. This is multifamily kind of work. To get into multifamily, you've got to have a good track record, you need to be heavily capitalized. This is DDG. DDG and Alloy both are crafting some of the most beautiful architecture in New York right now. And they're also selling units at one of the highest prices in the entire city. Actually, DDG and Alloy, I think, keep stepping on each other for who's the highest one in Brooklyn right now. But you also got to be pretty smart. So multifamily generally includes pre-selling units, and in these kind of ways you can get clever. Being an architect and developer means creating a lot of different entities and a lot of contracts with yourself. So to pre-sell this project in Philadelphia, there's 8 units here. They needed to pre-sell 2 units to get the financing, so they pre-sold one to the owner and the second to his mother. But it works, right? It's just money in escrow, it's a contract between yourself. The bank says, hey, you pre-sold 2 units, here's your loan. These are 3 guys in San Diego who had this idea while they were students to create an urban park with shipping containers. They didn't have any money, so they raised $60,000 on a Kickstarter to get some upfront fees down and show the mayor that they were serious about making this. The mayor said, okay, this is great, let me give you some cheap land on a 2-year lease. They did that, got some investors, pre-sold all of these shipping containers to the tenants with the stipulation that the tenants would hire them as the architects to design the thing and pay rent to them on a monthly basis. Now suddenly these 3 kids have a full-fledged firm, a project, and passive income. Okay, so this is all great, right? But as typical architects will tell you, they have no money. That's how you do this. The trick in real estate is nobody has money, it's always other people's money. So there's multiple ways you can do this. One is through investors, and maybe that's a structure where when you get the money back, you give them a 10% preferred return and a 50-50 split after. Maybe you have partners where somebody comes in and gives you all the money and you do all the work, and at the end you get a little. Or maybe you just get a construction loan where there's a 4 to 7 or even more % interest on it, and they'll give you up to 70% of the cost of construction. They're not going to give you all of it because they still want you to have some skin in the game, but they'll give you some. So how do you bridge that gap? And that's what I'm kind of interested in, because what a lot of architects have the same exact conversation on is no money. So the trick is you got to get a little bit creative. You can get something called mezzanine debt. You can do a construction loan, pull in an investor to bridge that down, what is known as a capital stack. I'm sure you guys are aware of this. And that brings your equity down to 10%. There's still a little bit in there, so how do you get that out? Well, the trick is architecture is equity. What a lot of banks will give you is that your fees as an architect can be put into the front end of a project and recognized. There's a lot of people that I've talked to that have been able to get 7 to 8% of a equity stake in a construction loan just because of the fact that their architecture fees were already done up front. Now this means that they also have planning permissions and all the permits and everything already put into it. They've actually done the real work. If you already have a relationship with a developer, you can do what we did at Gluck Plus, where you worked for sweat equity. We took no fees as an architect at the beginning of this project, and we had the whole thing built. And at the end of it, now Gluck Plus owns a percentage of this building and collects a % rent every month. It's a rental building in Philadelphia. But the risk here is that what happens if you sell yourself for free to a developer who promises you this stuff and they don't actually get anything built? It means you don't get paid. That's the risk. So what I'm really interested in terms of trying to bridge that gap with 10%, and I think is the next big thing is crowdfunding. This isn't your Kickstarter. Kickstarter is great, but there's a lot of fake money on Kickstarter that gets raised for architecture that never gets built. This is one of the first actual crowdfunded architecture works in the world, and it's a bridge in Rotterdam. Zeus raised 100,000 euros by selling planks of wood that you would CNC route your name into so that you'd feel special. And when they sold that, the city realized, hey, this is a serious piece of work, that the city actually wants it, and the city pitched in 4 million more euro, and they built the thing. It's great. But the real piece of crowdfunding is this, GSD grad. This is Kevin Kavanaugh out in Portland. This is not a rendering, this is a real building. And prior to 2012, in order to invest into real estate in a crowdfunding type of way, you had to be an accredited investor. That means you needed to have a net worth of over $1 million. Who has that? So as of 2012, the Jobs Act was passed. And the Jobs Act, every single year, has lowered the regulation down to regular folks that can be able to crowdfund and put money into a project down to, right now, about $500. So this is the first actual crowdfunded piece of architecture in America. It took Kevin 15 months and $200,000 of attorney fees to pull this off and get approval from the SEC. But after doing that, he was able to raise $1.5 million as part of his capital stack and get the building done. Since then, he had this other idea of trying to see if people would be willing to take less of a return for a social cause. So he decided to try and create a project that would have market rate housing that would subsidize housing for the homeless. Homelessness is a big deal in Portland. In 3 days, he was able to raise $300,000 that proved his point that people were willing to take a 5% return, which is very low, as an investor to make a building work. And that small interest rate allowed him to build a building that otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen, and homeless people wouldn't have a home. So I think it's really great work and really interesting, and it's a great way to try to tackle a homeless problem in the city. So the other thing now is Regulation CF, and this is Jonathan here, who will be our first speaker. But he's the first person to actually raise crowdfunding through Reg CF, which is the newest thing that's out now. His first project raised $95,000 as part of a capital stack that included $20,000 of his equity as an architect and $400,000 of a construction loan through something called Small Change. This is something that you can register for. This platform already has SEC approval, so Jonathan doesn't have to go out and do that. He has to give them all the information, all the stuff ahead of time, but then he was able to crowdfund a project, pull it off, and I believe, and he can tell you more about that one in a moment. And then he's already started his second one, also was able to crowdfund, and this one is for affordable housing for artists, which would also have a B&B component to it, and he's able to raise $112,000 as part of a $2.2 million capital stack. So really stepping it up and trying to give artist housing in the city of New Orleans through crowdfunding. I mean, this is a really incredible way to try to bridge the gap of the extra money needed to pull off a construction loan. So on that topic, I want to let Jonathan take this and talk about all of his projects a little more. So Jonathan Tate from OJT.
I feel compelled to talk at twice the speed that I normally do. So I'm going to have to slow things down just a little bit if y'all don't mind for a second, but you have to catch my breath after that. But thanks for the introduction, and by way of introduction, just I feel like, especially in the context of this panel, I should give a little preface to our office and the way our practice works in general, because I think that led, in many ways, the way we think about how we operate and what we do led to what I will eventually talk about. And first thing I'll say is that we prefer not to call ourselves architect developers, and what we do, we're architects that occasionally develop things. It's probably a better way to say it. We're as a practice, we're in many ways just a conventional or normative architectural office. We have private clients, a lot of those happen to be developers, but in addition to that work, we also meander quite a bit, and we sort of have an attitude about work that comes into the office as an opportunity for us to sort of take in different directions, and we very much sort of abide by the idea that let's just see where things, where curiosity leads us and where things lead in general. And so through the course of working on things, different projects, engaging with different people, we often are asking questions just, about what we're doing there, what we could be doing differently. And, we notice oftentimes that there are, opportunities in systems or in projects or in organizations that feel like, there might be a chance to engage in at different levels that aren't necessarily prescribed in an architect's, in pure practice terms. And some of this is just seeing opportunities and what we often call sort of holes in the city or cracks in the market in general is the way we've summarized it in some ways. Which, that attitude led to the project, which I'll talk about now, which is very much an exploration in looking for those kind of opportunities, and it involved a fair amount of development from our office. But if I can, I'll just start with the agenda and what this is about, just as a way to sort of summarize. It took us a while to get here, and this is kind of a neat summary of what we're trying to do, and I won't read it out loud, but you can sort of read through that. To get to this point was actually probably 4 to 5 years worth of work for us just to sort of crystallize what our objective was here, and we're still working through it. So this is kind of a work in progress for us. But in effect, it's a housing model looking at single-family housing in urban environments that are sort of challenging, the role of housing in general and form making, but what are opportunities to, develop and insert new types of housing in the city that address issues that I think we're all familiar with. And it really came from, as I said, sort of, curiosity and conditions that we were running into, and one being starter home in general. It was just sort of a unique and interesting term in some ways just to think about, something that we kind of hear a lot but don't really step back and think what that means exactly and what it means historically. So this is sort of the architect in us looking at this as an opportunity to engage in a typology, if you will, that often architects don't really engage in, or as we see it, sort of lost interest in engaging in some ways, but it made it easy fodder for us to dive into, and it resonated on a lot of different levels, just from intellectually. But it's also, as architects and practitioners working with developers and working with real estate agents, we understand there are really powerful forces too, which are underlined here, that drive what we live in, how we live in cities, and knowing and watching how decisions are made through that process as let's say, a consultant or a passive, having a passive role in that in some ways was always troubling, or something that we wanted to try to challenge in general. And then also, while development is pretty straightforward and simple in some ways, in its simplicity, it makes it quite difficult to try to crack, right? Like, it's a pretty straightforward formula where you should swap construction costs, in this case, is just project costs, let's say soft and hard costs. But, the elements that you can play with are pretty straightforward, all in all. So it's not hard to understand, but it's not an easy thing to dig into and try to correct. And I know people are constantly chipping away at different things like construction costs. How do you make housing cheaper? How do you make buildings cheaper? Looking at issues around land, and then certainly looking at how do you reduce profit or increase profit? But all that sort of driving ultimately what we as homeowners pay for a house, or how we're able to afford or how we're able to access housing, right? So in the process of doing this, I should back up real quick and say a lot of this thought was instigated by a couple of things. One is it was topical for us, myself and other people in the office were trying to buy housing in a city that was increasingly more expensive to live in, and especially more expensive to live in the areas that you wanted to live in New Orleans for, right? So it was the historic neighborhoods, it was all those things. So all around us, we were witnessing the kind of challenge that people were running into to try to access the market, if you will. And about the same time, I was working with a developer who was acting as a development consultant for an arts and residency program, who had a keen interest in, trying to address issues of affordable housing in the city. And so the two of us sort of got together and said, how do we figure this out? As James pointed out, it's like we didn't have a lot of resources to begin with, and neither did he. And so what we ended up doing was going, okay, if we're going to implement this, let's figure out how we're going to do it. And so we started with, as a way of looking at our city, like where were opportunities. And this went through a long process of just sort of sifting through. We were looking for vacant land in certain parts of the city, like where did they exist, where did lots exist, how could we find things. And as we were pilfering through all of this, we recognized that there was a fair amount of what we refer to in the city as non-conforming lots, or these sort of small odd lots or parcels of land that, and unless you knew better, you wouldn't have recognized that they were actually buildable pieces of land. But because we understood zoning, because we were able to locate this through GIS and other mapping tools, and that we knew how to sort it and find it, then we were able to sort of access something that we recognized a lot of people just didn't realize was an opportunity or couldn't get to. Furthermore, back to the speculative single-family developers, in this case, is like you recognize that most people are looking for the path of least resistance. In other words, they don't have small developers working this scale, don't have architects on staff designing new buildings for every site that they go to. We're naive and foolish enough to accept that we're going to design something new every time we encounter a site, which is not the most efficient thing to do, obviously, but it gave us leverage over the other people that were in the market. So here again, we're sort of trying to angle, look for ways that we can engage this and find chances to dig in and actually create some of this. So when we sorted everything on using the metrics that we sorted, we found roughly 5,000, a little over 5,000 of these lots in the city of New Orleans. And by non-conforming, these could be anything under generally 30 feet wide and let's say 100 feet deep. Some of these are quite small, which I'll talk about in a second, but they're also all over the place and indistinguishable often in your just sort of visual analysis of a city. Like driving around, you wouldn't notice these things. Often there were backyards for people. They were, covered in weeds and just not recognized, or they were part of, the abandoned right-of-way is kind of an interesting one, where there were these little remnants that just fell off through an easement or some other overlay that came through a neighborhood. So we were able to identify all of those, and we used from there we said, okay, let's see what we can do about this. We went down to the level of neighborhoods, so we started to look at proximity to downtown. Again, we had an interest in making sure this was sort of urban-centric housing. And we pinpointed one neighborhood. We spent a lot of time trying to acquire what turned out to be about 29 lots that were available in a neighborhood called Pires Channel. We tried to buy them all. We couldn't afford any of them, but that was fine. We just went for it. And in the end, and you should add that to your, it's like being cavalier and foolish should be part of the mantra as well. And that was, in our case, that's where we sort of began. But after all that effort, it turns out we were able to purchase one lot, which was the start of what became a series of projects that, as we began, we were not trying to create a prototype, which is another misnomer here. It's like these aren't things that we thought we could build one of and create multiples, right? That wasn't the objective. We weren't interested in that. And further, we didn't think we could solve it in one pass at it anyways. And again, back to the we're not developers, part of this model was like this was an exploration for us. And so every time we got into this, it was a chance for us to sort of challenge and push back on part of the systems that we knew about, at least initially discovered as we moved through, and then recognize as things that we had an opportunity to say something about. So none of this, and I should say, like the goal here was not to create the solution to this problem, but as a way for us to look at, and create a sort of form of advocacy about how, architects or developers look at the development of housing in our, cities in this particular realm. So anyway, what this led to was basically, I'll say 5 projects, but ultimately 17 houses. And they all, as I said, they all sort of have a theme. They all, chase one thing or another. And none of them are perfect and by any means, and we recognize as we finish one, these were the mishaps, this is where we messed up, this is what we wanted to engage and didn't have a chance to, so the next one, we try to pick that up. Again, this started about 5 years ago now, and we're coming to the end of it, I should say, but I'll get to more of that later. But the first one was the sort of quintessential small house, small lot. We started this project in 2014. By the end of 2015, it was constructed, and we had it sold by 2016, let's say. So like basically 2.5-year period to build a house on. It was in most of these you're going to see are in a neighborhood called the Pires Channel, where we're working in this case is right at the fringe of the kind of light industrial riverside development in the late 1800s neighborhood. Fabric that a lot of people might be familiar with in New Orleans. But this lot, as I said, is sort of a typical lot for us in that it was in a typical non-conforming, but in this case it was 16.5 feet wide by 55 feet deep. And so we went about trying to develop a home on this one lot. We foolishly thought we could get variances to work on setbacks. We found out people weren't willing to give us variances, and so since then we've sort of taken the mantra that we're going to abide by all the zoning regulations on every project that we do, and we don't ask for anything. This is in a historic district, so we have to go through a full historic review for compliance with historic district requirements, but nonetheless what we ended up with was basically let's say a 2-bedroom 1-bath house that's 10.5 feet wide by 45 feet deep, roughly 975 square feet. From that house we got a little, and so forgive me, I'm going to treat this as a narrative, how we move from one project to the next, and as a way to sort of talk about this work, but also to talk about our office, so it's going to sound like a story, but we're from the South and we tell stories. So the next project began as actually a client coming to us as a consequence of being told that we were the people in town that knew how to build tiny houses. For some reason, this is word got out that that's what we're interested in, but that's not what we're interested in at all, but that's fine, we'll take it. It turns out this person was actually homeless. He was able to purchase a very small lot that was on, again, non-conforming lot that they bought through auction, and wanted to build a house on it, basically. And so what we ended up doing was helping him develop basically an instruction manual for him to self-build what was, as it turns out, the smallest permitted home in the city of New Orleans. So right at 184 square feet. They had to, and that's gross dimensions, they actually had to rewrite some of the zoning or clarify some of their zoning ordinance as a consequence of this, because it defined a dwelling unit for them, like what the limits of a dwelling unit are, basically. And It is probably one of the uglier houses in New Orleans, I'm proud to say too. It's so pragmatic and wonderful in a lot of ways, and there's a whole dissertation here about both the person who we worked with, but also the kind of rationale around the house. But everything, I mean, he had no power, so it's all hand tools basically, and so even a lot of it's donated materials, like the color of the house itself. There's a Habitat Restore that sells paint, but they sell two kinds of paint. One is a beige, one is something else, and they get it through blending all the paint that they come in. So that you don't buy like a blue can, you buy a blended can, right? And so and it has a term, and so which I sort of love. But but from that, the next project, so starter home number 3 in this case was we had an opportunity to do a couple of things here. One is, like, as I said, we weren't interested in tiny homes, we're interested in family homes. So these are homes that people could grow into or have children in, but still, dealt with some of the main agenda or topics that we were trying to address in the project. What our third house involved was actually an opportunity for us to create that house, because the first one wasn't exactly the programmatically what we wanted to do, but it also, in this case, sort of turned what we saw as the conventional architect-client model around, in that we now had a client. In this case, we didn't develop this house, but we had a client come to us and said, hey, I want you to develop this for me. I want you to do what you're doing on this particular site. So whereas this whole project started because we assumed nobody's going to come to us one day and tell us to do this work, so we had to do it on our own. We had gotten to the point where people were coming to us and asking us to do it for them, so, which I thought, again, as a conventional practice-oriented person, it was an interesting turn of things. And so, vertically stacked house, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, big attic, these things all function well for homes, or they should. And again, small lot, but this one's 1,500 square feet house that we were able to get on there. And again, a part of this is it appears to be a 2-story home from the street. We squeeze a lot in the roof, and the way these things kind of conform. And then the next set of houses that we got into was, I'll kind of speed up here, but finish this up real quick. But the next set of houses that we got into were a cluster of, working on one house at a time is actually a whole lot of work and a whole lot of effort. That in that amount of effort and energy, you could do a lot more, actually. We recognized that early on, but it was just difficult to find larger parcels. And furthermore, one big piece of land just didn't make sense for us in these fee simple arrangements. But what happened is we were invited to basically propose on a larger site, which was adjacent to our first house, as you'll see here in a second. And in that process, what we had originally thought was going to be a simple, we're going to go carve it up and create our lots and put our houses on it, actually got way more complex, and we recognized that what we had wasn't capable of creating what we wanted to do, so we had to look for other ways to get into it. And part of that was we could make 3 lots on this site, but under the zoning ordinance we could actually do 12 units of housing. And so how do we, what we ended up doing was, actually turning to the legal constructs of land and how you define land through the condominium regime as a way of creating lots through the kind of legal parsing of the land and not the true subdivision of the land in this case. And so, now us as architects are involved in the configuring and the establishment of what is ownership in a condo association in this case. So we moved from the sort of traditional architecture role into the development role, but now we're in the sort of legal realm of trying to correct these things. And of course, we didn't draft the document, but we were involved in how you define what's owned. And at the time, nobody had actually worked a condo doc in this way, and so there was some kind of wraparound that we had to figure out. But anyway, so the results are this. We ended up on a lot that's about a little over 12,000 square feet in size. We ended up with 12 units of housing. These are all detached houses, so they're technically single-family homes. This is the constructed project, and again, you can kind of see in the distance there, or adjacent to it was the first house. You can see the funny peak popping up over it. These we bought the land in 2015, and we just finished up last year. And they're, again, like all the other ones, they're speculative and for sale. And then just to give you a sense of the texture of the house is in this case. And then the final ones I'll talk about as part of this whole process for us were the ones that James has already mentioned that we used. In this case, we turned to crowdfunding. So Again, one piece of this as you're working through is like you recognize all the elements of development and of architecture, and it's like what are the things that we can toy with, and equity is a big issue whenever looking for investors and looking for people to sort of help you put these things together. But it's often a privileged situation for people. They're able to come in and provide money for funds, and they have access to the returns on that in a way that most people don't. In what happened through our process, we were introduced to a woman named Picker who runs a small change. We spoke for a long time, and eventually we were able to sort of pull this last project, or a group of projects together. And as James has mentioned already, was able to get it on the site and became the first crowd-funded development in this case. And so, it was an interesting process, which I'm happy to talk about through questions, but it's and how you solicit people to sort of, here we want you to be a part of this development. It has all sorts of implications. I agree. I think it's phenomenal what it can do. It's also challenging. It's all of a sudden you realize like the way I talk to people about this project will influence who's willing to participate, and how much I'm asking for, because there's a minimum raise. We could have said $20, which means it's a lot of people. We could have said $500, which means it limits some of our people. We could have said $10,000, which is, Kevin has larger raises typically. And so that's something that you get to play with as a way to go who's my audience and who do I want to engage in this. And as was already mentioned, we were successful. We got the money that we were looking for the project. It's actually 2 houses, and architecturally this is one where, and we sort of challenging ourselves through this process. It's like, what does it mean to replicate these things? Are they supposed to look the same everywhere they go? They certainly stylistically begin to reference one another, but this was a case where we had 2 that were basically identical. And so here we are back to the how do we simplify our model but create some kind of diversity between 2 of the units. And so here's us going back and sort of in pattern book land looking at typical floor plans, but then manipulating facade treatments in order to create depth and difference, but also sort of playing off the 2. These are under construction right now. They should be done in the next couple of months, and so then they'll actually go on the market after that. But to sort of end here and to bring it around, it's like, it just is a reminder, this, what we're doing and why we're doing it is as much as anything an exploration and looking at how we can engage in this and to create examples for people to look at and then try to develop and emulate on their own. And whether it's the land, the small lot stuff, or whether it's the crowdfunding, or whether it's some other, whatever it is that we're doing, it's been interesting to see how people have reacted to that. But it's in our opinion, a form of advocacy and not really a business practice that we're up to. And this is, again, like back to us as an architect and as a model that we're working in and what we're trying to accomplish. So that's it.
I think we have Macy, are you up next? Somebody took the list. AJ, you have the list? Yeah. Macy from MSL.
Okay, so I'm Macy, and it's great to be back to the GSD. So my firm is MSL and Company, hence my initial, but I started this company because I wanted to focus on community type of development projects. And our focus is really building communities and also doing housing as a way to address the housing crisis in the West Coast. I'm from California. California is notorious for high housing prices. The affordable housing income limit is $120K in San Francisco, so if you make $119K, you qualify for affordable housing. So for me, as a resident and who've purchased homes there, I wanted to do something to help. And my background, way back when, was in architecture, but then I went into more on the investment and development side. So I take the perspective of finance and development and also from the regulatory perspectives, less so on the design side. I do work with architects a lot, but I also occasionally would do my own design if I so desire and we don't have enough time. I need to step in and do some CAD, I would. So that's where I am. Our firm focus is threefold. It's real estate development, development management, called fee development, as well as land use economic advisory. And the reason why we do this is because they're all integrated in terms of actual development projects, and when we work with public sectors on any type of development, it involves expertise in economics. So we focus on largely affordable housing and community projects, and these type of projects oftentimes is a joint partnership with the public and private sector, hence our breakdown in terms of what we do. Our firm has a very distinct value, and our value is really community-based. Anything that we do, any project that we touch, has to have some sort of impact on the community, whether it's building houses, financing, whether it's on the design side, sustainability, because it's a Bay Area, we're trying to be technologically innovative as much as we could, and we definitely have to execute. And so, oftentimes, this is how I feel as a developer. You blend in the art side, the artist side, yet you have to be very structured and very detailed when you're approaching your projects to the point where you have to make sure that it can be executed. And oftentimes this is what I have to do, is you have to be in the trenches through construction, development, management, financing, working with the public sectors. And I focus a lot on affordable housing because my background had been on the affordable housing, on the housing side really, both market rate and affordable housing. And I focus on the financing piece, the capital piece of affordable housing. And as a project itself, typically, or as a asset class, affordable housing, typically the complexity of financing is a lot compared to normal development. It usually ranges between 9 to 12 different capital stacks. And the regulatory compliance that we have to go through often takes a long time to build a project, in addition to satisfying the requirement in terms of the return for both investors, the city, county, governments, subsidies, and also ongoing compliance measures that we have to do. And because affordable housing isn't just housing first approach, meaning designing a building and then they would come, or designing a building and that it would give them a home, is usually involving some sort of services, because a lot of times affordable housing and homelessness as an issue requires mental health, healthcare services, workforce studies, a lot of different services that is needed for folks to be re-engaged into society or have some sort of support in general. Now on the workforce housing, which is folks who makes $119,000, that kind of service involve dog walking and such, and we don't really focus on that. This is a project, and I'm going to go through just images of projects we've done and also am doing currently and past projects. This is a project in Los Angeles. We built 87 units as in shared rooms for homeless folks. And we're actually cash flowing really well for this project, completely privately financed. And the reason why we do projects like this is because coming from affordable housing, a more the traditional development sense, the issue with housing is not so much the design. I mean, you can do it, construction cost is a factor, but also service is a factor, and funding is a factor, in addition to compliance, of course. So I wanted to start a firm that really focused on addressing the gap between financing affordable housing and building affordable housing and the services can be provided without going through any public subsidies or regulatory constraints on the outside, so we can build faster and actually work directly with the cities and counties to provide services for folks directly without going through all the compliance issue. This is one of them. There are folks who are from, different states who come, live here. It ranges between 6 months to 4 years, and they do have to pay a very small stipends, and everything else is subsidized. We are in partnership with different organizations in terms of giving them services, but they have a great structured home to live, and all of these, 100% were formerly homeless. And you'd be surprised to hear the story. Some were former bodyguard for like Hollywood stars, some were
ski instructors who went into drugs, some were just, bad times, divorce, etc. So everyone has a different story. Taking that approach, I'm working currently as going through council right now, 300 units of affordable housing. More traditional sense, but really focusing on low income, like very low income, because that's kind of my passion. And so, instead of typical traditional affordable housing, of all the subsidies, tons and tons of subsidies, underwriting, I'm partnered with the city and county actually together, and I asked them to give me land. So they gave me 95 different lands to choose from. I chose 5, usually in neighborhoods that are not going to have a lot of protest. So shy away from luxury community or downtown businesses where people who are homeless can be there. And I also didn't want to design something that looks like it's a homeless housing, because the identity and the dignity of folks who live there is very important to get them back on their feet, and it's not a temporary solution. And so it looks like normal housing with the occasional services on site, but it has to be integrated. And that one is the city and county director of homeless and finance folks went down to see the LA project with me to look at our past model, and now it's going through council. So we'll see if there are any protests. Protest is a big thing. We also work on community projects. Community as in working directly with cities and counties on establishing an identity for their cities to incite further economic development. Because of my background as a land use economist, that was also very important. This is an art center in the East Bay, and it was an RFP, so I'm the lead developer, and it would be privately financed on our own, plus Pixar Animation, plus the city. So we're asking the land from the city. City's putting in some money, about $3 million. We're putting in about $14 million, and Pixar is putting in about $2 million. And this is an art center. So what I want to do, because of the community and housing focus, is I also wanted to put in affordable artist housing. But it has to be toward the medium income level for that particular city. And I don't know how to describe it, but the parking lot, the structure itself, and also the back is all city-owned land. So this is our first phase, and our phase 2 is the parking lot where they're willing to give it to us as well to build artist housing, and that's 90 units. And that one I'm in partnership with my old company to do, and we're focusing on the art center piece. This one I did not do the design. We have an architecture firm, also GSD grad, who did this, and they did a pretty good job. And then this is another city where we do a TOD project by the train station. It's a mixed use with housing and retail commercial, but it's a historic, historic project with renovation as well as new construction. And that one is also going through council. So all of this came about with past housing development on the finance side and development. This is one of my past projects on the development side, 370 homes. That was when it first broke ground. That was after construction, one of the homes. So coming from this world, I'm really excited to really focus on affordable housing. No offense to luxury housing design. So because regulatory constraint, it's a big thing. And working with the public sector is a big thing. I'm recently appointed to be on a planning commission of the city, and then also the design review board now. So we would look at every single project that comes to our table and review their design with architects and the developers, look at land use. And that's really important also as a architect/developer to be involved in the community and also look at how behind closed door cities work before they approve a project, because we've seen projects where we didn't get approved because someone doesn't like how the roof look like, or land use on a bigger scale. Land use is an issue in terms of them not complying. So that's also quite important, and I encourage you to look toward the public sector. And that's it.
From Hybrid from Seattle.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Robert Humble from Hybrid. We're a firm in Seattle that has been around for about 15 years now. And there's really 4 key components to our firm. We have Hybrid Architecture, which is a really full-service architecture firm that's been mostly focused on high-density urban housing with units ranging from 50 to maybe 150 units. We have Hybrid Assembly, which is our construction firm, licensed and bonded, primarily building our own work as hybrid development, and which I'm mostly going to talk about tonight. And finally, we have Hybrid Space, which is a small street-fronting gallery space. So we host exhibits that really try to engage the community and talk about issues that are confronting Seattle. I think similar to in San Francisco, there's been a lot of strife the last 5 or 6, 7 years about cost of housing and how do we kind of grow with grace as we kind of try to provide more units of housing in a city that is really not very willing to accept it. So I'm also from the South, and I'm going to do a little bit of a storytelling here and how we really came about in the last 15 years. Hybrid, it really all started, I guess, in 2001 with the Nisqually earthquake in Seattle. It did quite a bit of damage to the Alaskaway Viaduct here, which is kind of this, a viaduct that was built on the Seattle waterfront that had kind of cut the city off from the waterfront for close to 50 years. And the city realized and the state realized that given the damage to the viaduct, it was going to have to come down. It became an opportunity for Seattle to kind of re-engage with its waterfront. So a friend of mine and I were invited by a group called Allied Arts to form a competition team as part of the Alaska, or was it Waterfront Design Charrette, to basically just come up with ideas for how this city could kind of re-engage with its waterfront for perhaps the next 100 years. And this is kind of a proposal that engaged quite a bit of, over the course of about a 2-mile strip of waterfront. One of our ideas that we presented here in the Waterfront Design Charrette was the idea of cargo town, or imagining a movable city. This was basically with the thought that successful neighborhoods don't really develop overnight. They develop over different economic conditions, over different zoning conditions. And we thought that maybe there was an opportunity that cargo town could kind of always act on the fringes of development and provide urban incubators to these formerly industrial parts of town. And we never had really any preconceived ideas that this would ever really happen, and that really wasn't the point. But it definitely engaged a lot of the community, and people, even 15 years ago, they were very excited about the idea of building something out of a cargo container. It's been shocking ever since then how many people approach us about that. And eventually, actually, the Home and Garden Network approached us and wanted to do an episode about cargo containers. So we leveraged that opportunity to get some cargo containers given to us, the rest of the materials and labor to build out the containers given to us. And essentially kind of our first, what we call our first development project, where we're really just leveraging opportunities out of thin air to create something that was important to us, to once again try to sit some of our ideas and bring them to ideation that would actually as a built object. So this ended up being on a couple television programs once again, got a lot of publicity, and that was really the foundation of Hybrid, where it kind of transitioned from what was a competition team to a more ideas-oriented architecture firm. And around this same time, I had sold a house that I had bought with my cousin 4 years earlier, and we spent 4 years basically improving this house. Nights and weekends, it was a lot of work, but we sold it, and I think we made about $180,000 on it. No, excuse me, $160,000. So we split that, $160,000, and I took my $80,000 and I went my way, and he went his own. And I've really used that ever since as the kind of seed financing for all the development I've done since then. So in I think 2006, when I bought this lot, land was cheap, and definitely debt was cheap. This is when you could get basically a liar's loan, and I think it took all like $10,000 at the time to buy. Not that I was lying, but it took about $10,000 to buy the land, and I was able to develop this project with the full $80,000. And around this time, we also then brought in some other ideas that we thought were important to us. And all the projects we're going to talk about tonight is these ideas of the flexible, adaptable house. And really what that is about is a house that can kind of change over time to kind of fit your changing lifestyle needs. Like if you have a baby, lots of times people have to leave their house or they outgrow their house. And I grew up, in Texas with parents who lived in their house for 50 years. They never did move. And I think nowadays, certainly in these urban environments, we kind of see this house as a commodity or something that you might have for 5 or 6 years, and then you're going to sell it and move on to the next one that's going to fit your lifestyle at the change. And there's a lot of transactional costs that happen economically. If you are in a strong economic environment, you might sell your house for $100,000 more and pass that cost on to the next buyer. If you're in a weak economic environment, you might sell your house and lose $100,000 in the process, or maybe basically just have to stay in your house because it cannot adapt to you. And I've always thought that was kind of stupid. I mean, if you go to a used car lot, you can buy the cheapest car on the lot, and it's going to have a radio that you can change the channel for. It's going to have some seats that you can adjust to your own personal ergonomic needs. And we thought an idea of a house that could do that would be successful in the market. So we wanted to bring that to some of our own development projects when we built Remington Court. So around this time in 2008, things were really happening. We felt like hybrid was cruising, and we had some good clients, and we felt like we were doing good work. Hybrid Assembly was actively building these projects, and we were having a great time doing it. And hybrid development was kind of getting some of its ideas out there in the market. And so what could go wrong? So I think we're going to move on to the second chapter of this. We're going to have to do what we have to do to eat. So when the market crashed, basically I was about $1.5 million into a construction loan for Remington Court. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment with my brand new wife, and I had no idea what I was going to do. But we stuck to our guns, and we stuck to our values, and we finished Remington Court, and we think it turned out great. And the market responded well to it. We ended up selling our 4 units in about 35 days, unfortunately for about 20% less than what our pro forma had projected when we started the project. So of my originally $80,000 that I put into it, I think I got $50,000 back. So that was kind of my first lesson as a developer, is you could actually spend 2 to 3 years of your life on a project that you actually lose money on. So moving forward, learning that lesson, I thought, well, one thing I don't want to do is try not to lose money on the next project. And I did. This is now 2009. There was no development happening in the city of Seattle. There were no loans to be had. But miraculously, I was able to get a 3% FHA loan to build my own house. So some of the things we did during this time was, with my 3% owner-occupied first-time buyer loan, I was able to act as my construction manager as well as a general contractor while we did the site work for this house. Probably worth noting, this house was actually built in a factory in Boise, Idaho. And we craned it in place in 1 day, and then it took about 6 weeks or so for us to button up all the house, make all the connections connected to the site. And this was also a LEED Platinum house, so we were able to experiment on some other things on my own house that we probably wouldn't trust ourselves to do with someone else's, specifically rainwater collection and using that for doing your laundry and flushing toilets and taking the gray water and actually treating that on site and filling with that until it was working out. So, and this was also a flex house. It has these movable wardrobes upstairs that you can partition the upper floor into either 3 smaller bedrooms or 1 larger bedroom and 1 smaller one, or you could just move these all to the side and have just 1 big space, which is really the way my wife and I live in it. Because we don't have any children, we just prefer to have, instead of having a small room with a yoga mat in it, we prefer to live in it more like a loft. I wanted to include this one too. Around this time, we rented a little Jiffy Lube that was going to be torn down. We rented it month to month for about a year for I think $500 a month to create what we call the Fabratory, to once again experiment on some other modular designs and CNC components. And really just kind of hone our craft. buckle down and make it through the big turn. And so this kind of moving into kind of chapter 3, I think around 2013, Amazon started to redevelop downtown Seattle and creating their offices down there, and as a result there was a huge population growth in Seattle, what we call the big boom. So in the last 5 years we've just been head over heels trying to keep up with this. I think all of Seattle has. So with the big boom, more than 1,000 people in 2017 were moving to Seattle every week. I mean, that's an amazing number for a city the size of Seattle. And obviously with that, that brought a lot of distress to the community. Seattle was topping the nation in housing price growth, as well as a lot of issues related to gentrification, displacement, and specifically loss of community, or people getting pushed out of their communities, feeling they could no longer afford it. So something really interesting also happened to us at this time is that people were familiar with the work that we were doing in the neighborhood, and I feel like there were some property owners that had built up a lot of equity in their land over the preceding years, and they began approaching us to work with them to redevelop their sites. So this had a lot of economic advantages as a developer, is that we didn't have to go on the open market to buy these lots. Typically, it's a great site, you put in a bid, there might be a dozen other developers that are also bidding in it. And in the past, when we have done that and actually won these sites, it's hard to know, did I win or did I lose? I know that I won the property, but I also know that I was willing to pay more for it than the other 12 people. So it's just an uncomfortable position to be in. So in the last 5 years, we've tried to avoid that process by working directly with owners of the property that wanted a little bit of more editorial control over how their sites would be redeveloped. The first one we did was just about a block away from our office. There's some friends of mine that had lived in this little house for about 30 years, had been approached by some developers to buy their lot and house, double lot, for about $900,000, tear it all down and maybe build 6 new townhouse units on it. But then the Zozels, they'd be homeless. They'd have to go out on the open market and now try to find a new place to live in a neighborhood that they'd lived for the last 30 years and were very active in. So instead we worked with them and basically bought their lot and house. They rented the house that they lived in for 30 years from us while we built 7 new units around it. And then when the end of construction, they ended up basically moving from the existing single-family house down to the townhouse. And as a developer, it was a great deal for us, because then we after they moved, we gave the house a paint job. It was in great shape internally, and we sold that house for $600,000. So as an architect, it brought my land basis down from $150,000 a door to something around $45,000 a door. So we really realized about $100,000 in profit per unit, and we're able to keep the existing house, which kept the streetscape intact, and creating smaller units that we then sold at a lower price point than some other developers were doing in town. The next project we did was a similar scenario where there was a woman that lived in about a 4,000 square foot house and had 2 adjacent vacant parcels. She approached us and we ended up designing a smaller 1,600 square foot house that she then downsized into and moved in, and we built that one while we built the house in the back for ourselves as a development project. This once again led to another great opportunity for us that we didn't have to compete for the land on the open market. Because when you do buy this land, the one thing is for sure is that we talked, how do you get into this? One of the barriers, I think, as a small developer is getting the land, particularly in an expensive market. Because if you're going to have a desirable piece of land, you can't really get a bank loan on raw land, so you have to either have that kind of cash or bring in some partners early in the project, or get a hard money loan, which has a lot of risk associated with it. And then you're just sitting on that for a year and a half or 2 while everything's working its way through permitting, and if the market tanks during that time, now you own a piece of property with about a 10 or 12% interest rate that is worth less than it was when you bought it. And as an architect, I've seen some of my clients that have really gotten out over their skis and have just tanked doing that. So that's one thing as a developer that we try to avoid, is try to get into scenarios where we do not actually close on the land until we have permits in hand. And a lot of times we can do that by working with the homeowners, because they're patient. There's a give and take. You know, they want this editorial control of being able to stay in their neighborhood, and they want editorial control of knowing there's going to be a nice project that's going to be one of their new neighbors, and they're willing to basically forego, I guess, a quick sale on their land to do so. So that's been a great advantage for us. Finally, this was a really interesting one that we just sold most recently. An architect friend of mine, you know, he and his wife, who is also an architect, you know, they wanted to design and build a house for themselves, but couldn't really afford to develop it themselves as a single-family house. So he approached me and said, "Hey, if I can find a lot, you know, would you purchase the lot, and then we would get to design our own unit, and then sell one of that same unit back to me, you know, at the end of the project?" And I said, "Well, sure, why not? I'll think about it." I did not really thinking that would actually happen. But, you know, probably 4, 5, 6 months later, he called me and he had found a lot. And we had to, this is one we did actually have to pay. There were 12 bidders, we had to pay the most for it. And thankfully his father-in-law had helped another sibling put some money down to buy her first house. So he actually financed this land for us, raw land, for like a 3% loan or something like that. That allowed us to kind of get the land at a reasonable price through kind of, you know, creative financing through the father-in-law. This, by the way, also utilizes the idea of these flex spaces. So at the end of the project, you know, my friend, they moved into the kind of the premier unit in the front, and I was left with 2 additional units in the back. I think another advantage of kind of doing things is clearly something, it looks quite a bit different than a lot of the other development in town. We feel like there's a lot of value in creating something that is very uniquely different in the neighborhood. And in this case, my friends Stephen and Kaylin took the front unit. It was some friends of theirs that were interested in buying a unit, bought the one in the middle, and someone from just down the street in the neighborhood bought the unit in the back. So this is also great for us as a developer, as we never had to put these units on the market and list them with an agent. So that would have been probably $120,000 that we just would have bled right off to agent transactions. And instead we paid an attorney maybe $1,200 to draw up the documents and sold them internally. This too, I ran into these neighbors. This is kind of an example of the flex house. There's a little courtyard here where you can kind of enter through the back and enter this ADU space. And in the summertime, this ADU rents for about $160 a night, I think, and it generally pays for 100% of their mortgage on about an $850,000 unit. In the wintertime, rental rates are less for an Airbnb, so it pays for about half their mortgage. So, you know, we're as developers, we're not working in a subsidized market. We're working right out there in the exact same market as other developers are doing, and basically things are going to sell for what they sell for. Unfortunately, you know, they're going to get an appraisal. We let the market kind of set the price. Generally, what we're trying to do is do smaller units, do these flexible units that can either add some rental opportunity or also double the density in some cases. So if this was a lot that the density would allow for 3 units, it would also allow for 3 accessory dwelling units. So this is just adding density, which I think is adding toward affordability. Finally, this year we also did our first apartment project that we do a lot of for other people. We did this one for ourselves, and it just got leased up, and now we're bringing in some investors so I can pull a little bit of cash back out of the deal. But in this case, we were really looking, there's a lot of what's called CDU units in Seattle, or small efficiency dwelling units. These are basically studio apartments that are a little under 300 square feet. So what we want to do with these smaller studios is each of them has a private either patio or deck that kind of, once again, the classic kind of blend the inside and out so that these smaller units feel larger and have access to the outside and are not dark. And stacked above that on the same footprint, we have these lofts essentially that adds an opportunity for a sleeping space in the loft above, and obviously the volume created within the loft gives a much more bigger feeling of space. So we've been excited about kind of how that project has worked, and we definitely took some risk on that one financially, because generally I'm not bringing in outside investors, bringing in partners. So wrapping it up, I think, in review, the architect as developer, we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good idea about the architect as developers is your ideas get built, you can control your own destiny, and you can make some money along the way. The bad part is that you can also lose some money along the way. And although I think we as architects, as developers, lots of times we think that we're coming into the community to save the community of all the urban ills that are being created, you know, with this density. I think a lot of the time the community sees us as the villains in the story and gentrifiers, and that's just the reality of it. That there's you know, Seattle has a population that visions their city in one way, and kind of like, I've got mine, and I'm not going to let anyone else come in, and you can have yours. So they're very adverse to change, and that's just a difficult spot to be, I guess, as a developer that you have to live with. And finally, the ugly is bankruptcy and liability. I've been lucky enough to avoid bankruptcy, but liability is something that you live with just every day. You know, we're responsible for these units for 7 years. And every big windstorm or rainstorm that happens, I'm always, you know, thinking, am I going to get in the office in the morning? I'm going to get an email from an old buyer that says they've got a leaky window. So as architects, you're kind of like, when the project is done, you're kind of moving on to the next one. As a developer, you're always responsible for these things. So these are a lot of the other projects we've designed in our architecture firm, and we have been very prolific in this last boom. We've designed 1,472 units of housing in the last 6 years, which when they tallied that up was shocking to me. But when I put that against the population growth, this represented less than 10 days of population growth in the city of Seattle, which was also an amazing fact. So I think, you know, it's really kind of, I guess, it's a bigger project or a bigger problem than everyone in this room. But maybe if we can have some ideas and inspire others along the way, I think we can have a bigger impact than what we're mostly directly responsible for. Thanks.
And next we have AJ from Alloy from New York.
Hi everybody, I'll try to be fast, there's a lot of slides. And a lot of the themes are the same. I mean, I could tell some of the same stories as a lot of the three, just about kind of following your own personal passion and taking risk. And to that end, I'm going to go really quickly through the first 10 years of our firm to talk about what we've been focused on for the past few years. Just really briefly, we are, I guess, like the traditional architecture development company. We just do a lot of the affiliated services in-house. So we do our own architectural work, and we do our own brokerage. We do our construction sometimes. We're a real estate development company. We just happen to have a lot of affiliates in-house. I'm an architect, my partner's an architect, most people in our office are architects. But we think of ourselves as just making buildings. We did a series of projects, one after another, one or two at a time, that grew in scale from renovations to ground up to larger ground up. And I got to post this slide by saying I'm not intending to spike the ball here, but actually I'd like to try to move the conversation past whether this model works, because it definitively works. We won a tremendous amount of awards for our work, proving that being a developer does not need to sully the architectural result of the work. We've also established that our product, from a real estate lens standpoint, is worth more if your value set is about money. And that's all great and wonderful, and it should be inspiration for people who want to take the risk, because it definitively works. But what's been interesting is, as our firm has matured, what we have spent more time both talking about and enjoying with the effort of the industry, which in a city like New York, where there's a tremendous amount of privilege to be doing what we're doing, and an incredible inequity in the housing and general real estate market in the city, it's very difficult to ignore the impacts that we have as, call it builders, whatever the title you want to give ourselves is. But if you're having real agency in making things in a place like a city like New York, as I'm sure it is for both Seattle and San Francisco and New Orleans, there is a lot of impact that you have, whether it is about the amount of energy your buildings are using, the amount of resources that they're using, the amount of jobs that they're employing, forgetting just the basic fundamental of its impact on the built environment phenomenologically as an architectural expression, or its financial capacity to be underwritten and successful. And so, really quickly as a lead up to one of the projects we've been working on recently, it was through some of the kind of ancillary work we did around projects. This was the last project I showed, 1 John Street in Brooklyn Bridge Park, which we did a pop-up pasture around in advance of the project because we had a year to kill before we started construction. And it was a kind of great little pop-up park that we built and opened up to the public. And similarly, because it was a public RFP that we won, and we were trying to connect to the park that we were in, we ended up donating the space to a local children's museum that we fit out for them and built. And while the project was successful financially and we sold units, those pieces ended up being the pieces that I took the most personal pleasure from. The Children's Museum continues to serve 10,000 kids and families a year, and people still talk about that pasture as a part of their memory of place, more so than the kind of private real estate development mechanics of what we did. We've spent time, again, because we've had the privilege to start talking about things in the city that are happening from an advocacy standpoint, actually kind of absent real development plan. This was an RFP we responded to with Soil in collaboration with that firm, where we were proposing actually a different subsidy model where by fixing our return as a developer, we could leverage the long-term increasing value that the market rate side of these mixed-use projects generally threw off to further subsidize affordable housing. Usually that equation is fixed at a moment in time when you develop, and then the developer benefits in the future from the future increase in the market rate. We were proposing to cap that and to try to further create incentive and subsidy within that model. It was not a plausible proposal. We were not going to win the RFP, but it was a nice piece of advocacy relative to talking about alternative models for affordable housing in the city. Similarly, in a neighborhood where we actually didn't control a large piece of property and had no real development plan, we had spent a lot of time engaging what was a fairly wonky infrastructural issue about stormwater discharge, and ended up doing a project over the summer that was really like a public advocacy and education project that had no actual end game towards development. And again, this was a project that we continue to get letters about, oh, that's so great. And I was walking by with my kid, and it's a way in which we're recognizing that just what we do, which is envisioning something in the built environment that has an impact because it's a big physical thing, can achieve. And so with that context, we recently went through the city's Uniform Land Use Review Project to entitle a full city block in downtown Brooklyn for a variety of stuff. And it's a fairly interesting site that is on a very heavily trafficked corridor on Flatbush Avenue in downtown Brooklyn, surrounded by a bunch of brownstone neighborhoods. It is across the street from the Williamsburg Savings Bank, which, if you know, Brooklyn is one of its oldest skyscrapers and was located here 100 years ago because of its kind of transit-rich location. The Atlantic Terminal, which is Brooklyn's largest transit hub, is across the street. It's where all of the train lines from Long Island City end. And our site was always kind of designated to be part of a future downtown Brooklyn future with skyscrapers. Of course, none of that happened in the 1930s. There were wars, and then there was flight from the city, and that building was there for a while. But the context around the site now, and I'm missing a slide that's showing the kind of current skyscraper corridor, is a real tough adjacency one, where there is a tall skyscraper district adjacent to a bunch of brownstones. What we decided to do as part of the process of getting this project approved was to actually accept all of the myriad stakeholders that we knew would be out there as essentially clients in a process that was incredibly iterative over a long period of time to speak to what people were focused on relative to whatever their interests were, whether it was about housing or office space or design or transportation or the environment. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time just meeting with people to listen to what their focus was. It defined some of the programmatic organization around the site, where we had a low-lying context to the south, where we located things like residential and lower schools, and a much busier context to the north with an Apple store across the street and Whole Foods and an 8-lane highway where we located more commercial and heavier trafficked uses. It informed decisions around historic preservation. It confirmed an approach towards building schools as standalone civic buildings versus kind of pieces of podiums that were undistinguishable. There was a kind of endless series of inputs from literally hundreds of people over months and months and months on very specific things, heights of setbacks and materiality. And as architects and developers, we had the unusual capacity to listen and respond as that conversation went on and continue to iterate. And to treat that process as, okay, that's a constraint that we can chew on and understand and try to accept. We ended up with a 5-building project that's completely surprising in retrospect on its result. There's a triangular tower towards the point of the site that's kind of in dialogue with the Williamsburg Savings Bank, both from its material standpoint and how it sets back in a more contemporary but similar way to that building. We had a taller tower that was, at the end of the day, a fairly simple transformation of a square floor plate to a circular floor plate, but that was really the focus of a lot of consternation because the original proposed tower was 984 feet tall. And the community reaction to that was, that's entirely too tall, and make that shorter. Not for any reasons that any of us would have a conversation about in an architectural studio about height and impact and shout as wind, just an emotional response to something that has changed was too much change. And so we worked with that as a constraint to find ways to take a tall, slender tower and try to manipulate program within it to make it both squatter and less impactful on the skyline, but still respecting all of the principles that got us to the master plan. We ended up with a fairly unusual kind of assemblage of volumes, a massive office space that floated over preservation space, which actually ended up freeing us up to think of, again, we kind of just took the design challenge and the resultant massing as another design opportunity. Like, oh, well, then what does that yield? And began to think about a tower that sat on an assemblage of buildings and how could we express that as something that almost spoke to the unusual instability of an assemblage of buildings. So we shaped the bottom of that tower and expressed it as on top of these other volumes. And the resultant project, which is 2 public schools for 700 or 800 students, 900 units, 200 of which are affordable, 200,000 square feet of office space, retail space, a cultural institution, and some historic preservation. Again, it was only formed through that process of a kind of non-linear and not even really merit-based at times, meandering through a community engagement. And here it is in the context of Brooklyn with Manhattan in the background. It's the 2 buildings on the kind of lower left. What was so apparent through the process is what we talked about as the achievement of the project, which actually had nothing to do really with the architecture or the economic scale of the project. The project needed to be financeable to work, but outside of that, everything that we talked about was around what we were achieving with real estate development, right, as a land use achievement. So it was things like public infrastructure in the form of schools and affordable housing, what we could do from a social equity standpoint relative to engaging the local community for things like jobs and future housing opportunities, what our sustainable goals were, how we worked with the city in order to create a numerous variety of programs that were all building on basic economic development intent. And so even as we do more traditional projects, which are for sale condominium projects, and this is the latest one in our office, which is a kind of straightforward conversion of a couple of existing buildings with some additions, and it'll be really nice, and I'm sure we'll sell really expensive apartments. We're starting to find ways to candidly right the imbalance of what is an inequitable market in the city. In this instance, we're creating a donor-advised fund that is managed by a local community foundation that the operations of the building will throw off dollars toward in a kind of nobody loses free money way that forever can generate, candidly, dollars that can go to other things in the city. There were over $40 billion of real estate sold last year in the city, right? So the amount of transactional volume that's happening in a supply-constrained, high-demand city like New York City is an economic machine that can be tapped in a variety of ways if you can be creative about it and get beyond the kind of lowest common denominator value set of, well, I'm just going to make money, or I only care about this, or I only care about that. So we spent a lot of our time thinking and talking about that, and the funniest thing is we have a section of our website, you know, we have a part where we talk about who we are, and we have a part where we talk about our project, and we have a part that's just like other stuff. And it's what we spend most of our time talking about, which is what are the ways in which we're engaging in the place and we're working, and what are the exciting partnerships and collaborations we have. The day or a few after we had this large project entitled, which is, it's an $800 million project, it's 1.2 million square feet. We won the pumpkin carving competition at the Center for Architecture, and that posting actually trumped the one of the approval of the project, because that's what we were excited about. And I think that that's true to kind of all of our stories relative to what's driving us to follow our passion about what we're personally connected to. And I think the more you drive at what real estate development really is, right, which is making shelter and space for people in places where they've come together to live as a community, there's a tremendous amount of impact that goes far beyond what the architectural opportunity is, what the economic opportunity is. It's really a stewardship opportunity relative to community. So with that, I'm going to stop.
So I'm curious, you guys have all talked about like how different projects and different ways of touching into sort of social equity within development, and you all have architecture backgrounds. I'm wondering if you think that as an architect, as a person who's educated as an architect, that it gives you more of a social equity stake in projects than a normal developer, but at the same time the sort of juxtaposition of Macy talking about the protests and Rod, you showing the photos of the gentrifier, you know, like how does this evil vilification of a developer while the sort of social, you know, cause of an architect, how do those combine, and what is that juxtaposition like? This guy right here.
So I want to get the plug in for Jesse Keenan, who taught me this, who teaches here, which is there is no guild for real estate development. There is no body that says you may be a real estate developer and license you, and there's no standard of ethics anywhere. Anybody that owns a piece of property that does something with it is a real estate developer. So if you're thinking about where is the place where I can learn a value set or a set of ethics around what should happen in the built environment, architecture school is it. That is the place where you are sat down in your studio and somebody says, ultimately, right after you kind of get your chops together, pick a site and define a problem and what should happen here. Right? That's what you're being trained to do, and that has to do with community and engagement and what the appropriate thing to do is. And it's really the best place to learn it. So, like, definitively, yes, and it's because there is no alternative. There's no other place where you would learn it.
I think the value of design is extremely important in architecture projects, both for lower income housing and or normal project types, just because design actually brings up the market value if it's a market rate project. But I think way back when, as architects, I think it's really important that I've learned is to work as a team with public and private sectors, because sometimes even though the intention is good and also there's known benefits to the community and public sectors, and also you're making a lot of money, there will be people who, for whatever reasons, feels differently about a project. So for instance, I'll give an example, is I work with the governor's office in California to streamline affordable housing. So we have a buy rights bill legislation that is supposed to be making affordable housing faster and bypass local jurisdictions. But we got a lot of protests from neighborhood groups and the Sierra Club because they felt like we were stepping on their toes and not listening to them. And these are things that we, made a conscious decision to work closely with, but for one way or the other, there would be protests. I think one of the key things that I've learned is using design as a value-add tool for any development projects to help increase the ultimate community value that it can hold, but also in the process working with the neighbors of the public and private sectors to make it a little bit easier on architects when you guys are developing or designing projects.
Add to that quickly. I think when we were working on smaller projects, it seemed like a lot of our developer clients were coming from a construction background, and would know how to build things, but weren't really interested in creating a sense of community or want to bring a whole lot of creativity to the table at the front end of projects. And as our projects for other developers have gotten bigger, a lot of these guys are coming from a finance background, and they can run a spreadsheet and have experience in building an investment team, but look at these projects in a lot of ways as a kind of the financial strength and the ways of mitigating and minimizing risk. So I think architects are kind of uniquely suited to become developers because of the three. I think it's really the architects that kind of approaching this from either a community-based background or maybe see some other creative opportunities that the builder or the financer will not. Lots of times we'll develop infill sites that were forsaken by other developers for whatever reason. They're difficult to permit, they're difficult to build on, or they just don't see the opportunity there. So those are the ones in particular that are generally undervalued, that gives a little bit of an angle for an architect developer to work and get into the project economically, and then develop a project kind of capitalizes on the opportunities that the site presents, while bringing some of their own additional ideas to the table throughout the process. And also as an architect, we're involved a lot. I was on the design review board myself in Seattle, and I present just about every week or every other week one project or another through the design review process, and we engage with the community. So that's kind of part of our role as architects, is this community engagement and presentation of ideas and getting community buy-off. So that's something that once again, I think that at least in our career, we've become more and more skilled at, and we can bring that to bear when we're on developers as well.
And speaking of that community engagement, I mean, AJ, if I understand correctly, all the partners at Alloy, and also with Jonathan, you guys actually live within the multi-unit projects that you develop. Like each one of the partners is in one of the different buildings. Do you feel that helps foster the community and maybe de-vilify the developer or the person who built it?
I mean, it's not why I live there, right? I live there because I want to live in the thing that I designed, and it's a great neighborhood to live in. I think it adds a slight bit of credibility and authenticity when you can say, and my kids are going to school here and I live here, right? And that's true too. But it doesn't change how people will ultimately feel about a proposed change, right? And it's about change that's coming from somewhere else that is oftentimes not what you might want to see. And that's not incorrect, right? That they're not wrong to be wary of that, skeptical of that. And candidly, the development peer set sucks, right? Their value set is corrupt, and they're not offering people any hope that they should be trustworthy or, right? And suspend that disbelief. So I think it's, beholden on us to lead, right? And to offer a better potential. And it's maybe not our fault as architects that when we put on the developer hat, we have a long road to hoe, but it's certainly a road worth hoeing, because you can candidly chart another course, right, and offer another potential. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, it's actually an interesting point, and likewise, I didn't plan a project to actually live in it. It just turns out circumstances dictated that it was a wise choice. We talked about it a lot internally, and in some ways, I agree with AJ. It certainly lends credibility to the development. The bank loved that we were buying one of the units, all that stuff, right? Like, that's fine. But on the other hand, if you were to look at it from the outside, it's like, well, of course you believe in the project because you did it anyway. So are you really gaining any confidence from the community that you're working in? Not necessarily, because it was something that you proposed anyway. So in some ways, maybe it's a negative impact in that respect. So I don't have a clear answer for that necessarily. It is an interesting phenomenon, and frankly, like, given it wasn't something that was baked into the deal to begin with, it's something we've sort of grappled with as we moved in. It's a strange position to be in a place, and maybe you all will agree with this, but all of a sudden you feel like you're watching over everything, or the impression that you're there to make sure that nobody does anything they're not supposed to do, and that's challenging in some ways, and from a human interaction standpoint. but you can have fun with it too. So it's definitely it's been interesting. I mean, that's the way I can say it.
Do you guys feel as though being a contractor is a valuable asset to the architect and developer model? I mean, or even like alternative practices of using the prefabricated units and stuff. Is this sort of engender you to push those boundaries, or do they all just kind of roll together?
I think we are our own general contractor, really more as a necessity to act as our own general contractor on our own development projects, to control the process, control our budgets, execute the details, and frankly, that's the practical part of it. But we also really enjoy it. I think I grew up in the suburbs of San Antonio, and there was a lot of lumber laying around, a lot of new construction, and I spent all my time in the summers building forts as a kid, so I actually got into this profession more on the construction side of things and the design side of things. And I think it's great to be able to build your work, although, quite frankly, I take almost zero pleasure from owning a construction company. I love being an architect, absolutely. I mostly love being a developer, at least the end result. Being a contractor sucks. It's horrible. It really is. It's like it's just, no one is ever thankful to have your contractor on site. Anything you're building for yourself, building for anyone else, the best day in their year is the day that the contractor leaves the job. And we get into situations where one of the projects we developed it, and we think, well, we're creating this community and bringing all these people together, and what a wonderful thing. And that last project I presented, now it's cutting on their 1-year kind of callback warranty, and they hire a home inspector who comes and finds fault, whether it's there or not, with different aspects of the construction, and it's hard not to take that personally. That the community that you created a year later, 5 years later, is banding together to attack you, to solve a problem that may or not be there. And I understand it's these people's the biggest asset that they have, and it's important to protect that asset. But unfortunately, as architects, we're creating, speaking to our clients one-on-one. I think once you move through the construction development, sometimes, unfortunately, the communication happens through attorneys.
I would add, we started our construction company to do a townhouse project. I showed it briefly because we were anxious that the market wouldn't be able to achieve it. It was a passive house series of townhouses with a ductile facade. It was a banana land from a development standpoint. And so we set up the company, we got a license, and we executed it, and it was immediately like, oh, that was a horrible idea for my quality of life. Instead of 1 CM to yell at, there were 24 subs to yell at, and like every problem just, was a further deeper rabbit hole. And it's sometimes nice to have a counterparty, right? To just say, that's your responsibility, and I'm leaving now. And we still have it, and we still threaten it every once in a while. We're like, I might just do it myself then, but we really don't want to. And it's every once in a while comes in handy to do something incredibly unusual, but it's not our typical MO for how we would execute a project. We would prefer to have a third party.
With Macy and AJ, both of you are in the developer hat, and you have your developer hat on. You're both in a position where you hire other architects to do some of the work. I was wondering if you could talk about when you make that decision to actually outsource some of the work versus wanting to get in there and design it, put that, take your pencil out and your sketch paper and go to town.
I think it's a very difficult process when you're not doing the design and architecture to hire someone else to do it. I think inherently you want to be part of the design process. So I think one of the things that I've looked at, for instance, it's the type of project. So if it's housing, it's a little bit more straightforward. Really wanted to work with folks who understand housing, affordable housing, how to streamline the design process. For something like an art center, I was really looking for a high design architecture firm. So I've talked to Snowhead, I've talked to Gary, and the big thing that really comes down to is budget. Can they stay within budget? And not all of them can. So we ended up going with a very design-oriented firm, which is great, who can somewhat stay within the budget. And after
explaining, the financing structure and how that's really important, especially as a public-private partnership. So I think it just depends on the type of project. For homeless housing, I would sometimes get involved with the design just because I'm more familiar with housing, but we usually work with folks who have a lot of experience with like homeless housing and affordable housing that I've worked with in the past, and who do really good work.
Yeah, for us, because we're an architect developer, we get to choose when we're the architect or not, right? So all of our build work we've been the architect of record for. The instances when we've collaborated have been when we know we're not going to build it. So for instance, that RFP with Soil, we were never going to win because we were just breaking the rules by starting. And we like for engineering, we're like, screw it, let's come up with something, it's valuable as an exercise. In the project in downtown Brooklyn, we're working with ARO to design the schools because that is a standalone, almost fee development project to design and build and construct and deliver a school for the city, where us being the architect of record was not of value, and we weren't building something that we would own or control in that way. It was really a fee job, and so we wanted to disassociate our staff from that as an effort.
Jonathan, when we spoke last year, you were talking about, I believe, where you had a role as more of a consultant, trying to pair land banks with adjacent nonprofits. Are you still doing that work? I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a confused thing that's hard to unpack, honestly, and I'm not going to try to here, but the effort, what we were describing, or the context of that discussion was how what we had begun in New Orleans and the model that we had implemented there was transferable to other locations. And so the kind of course of that work, we've been engaged by people, developers, individuals, whatever, from different cities and different locations, and spent a lot of time, too much time probably, just working through and explaining ways that what we're trying to do in New Orleans would look different where they were from, right? So whether it's in Houston or San Antonio or Toronto or New York or wherever, it would act and feel and do things differently. And so what we were actually discussing was in Louisville, where we spent quite a bit of time just trying to figure out how to again sort of implement an agenda where the land plays are different, and in that case the cost of property in the neighborhoods that we were exploring is rather cheap, so there's no real leverage when you find a small lot. A big lot's cheaper than a fraction of a piece of property that we're used to, and so under the circumstances, what we were actually looking at were how we could collaborate and engage with other landholding entities to facilitate development in areas that just were underdeveloped, basically. And so that was the model. In other cities, we've sort of gone back to similar analysis where we're looking for opportunities and different site conditions. And I mean, I could illustrate some of those, but it's we always sort of start there as a place to begin, and it's not, I mean, because as I was saying earlier to someone, it's like we know what our focus is, so it's not, every project's not, at least in that vein. We've got a bunch of stuff going on, but at least in terms of the housing, it's like we know what we're trying to create, and so the mechanisms that we're trying to manipulate are very specific. In that case, we're not worried about whether it's going to be a school or whether it's going to be high rise or whether it's going to be this. It's like we know it's going to be housing, and we're just heading in that direction. And so that's when we're able to focus more on what the opportunities exist with land and working with other entities, and just looking for combinations and let's say strategies or tactics in this case that would facilitate the kind of development that we're after.
So AJ was very definitive, but for the rest of you, does design sell?
Definitely. Yeah, I think we find that, we spend, we'll invest a little bit more in the projects, and unfortunately, like the townhouse project types that we do, they'll generally, there's a comp. So you take all the townhouses within a 10 square block area, and they're all going to sell for whatever, $500 a square foot. And you kind of need to be in that range, and we can achieve a little bit of a premium of that, but we're also generally building some smaller units, and they're a little bit of an outlier within that comp. So, but what we see is that our units, they sell fast. I think there's a lot of kind of these units that people see. I imagine homeowners going on an open house tour on any given weekend and seeing 10 units, and they're all kind of the same, and then would see kind of come back and there's this one unit that had something that was unique, and that was different about it. And we always kind of want to be that one unit that someone's going to talk about. I think as a result, our units typically sell fast and at a premium, which I think design sells.
I don't know. I'm probably not as definitive about it in some ways, and it may be market driven to some extent. Where although New Orleans has a reputation, it's still a conservative town. I would say people, our market's thin, and we have a tendency to make what is presumably our market even thinner by some of the actions that we take. And without getting into detail, it's like we make decisions that actually reduce the people that would be interested in the project. So there's some, we shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak, in some cases. And then we've also, what's been interesting, regardless of whether it sells or not, and we've done fine. We work with the comps, and in fact, we try to sort of stay at the bottom end of any comps and not create a premium. That's sort of the ethos of this. It's like, well, I pay extra for this, even though it may have more value. But the thing that, as I should say, that's been interesting is one, like the real estate industry in general, and so that's a whole nother soapbox that I could get on. That's really like fascinating, and how, if you're working with the real estate organizations, they sort of drive you towards the lowest common denominator in some ways, and learning how to, and frankly, being in a position to resist the input at the beginning levels of a project have been really, that feels in some ways like the most powerful thing we can do, is say, that's fine that you think that's what the market dynamic is, but we're going in this direction. And we can say that as an owner, in this case, and normally as an architect, you don't have that as a choice. So that's been illuminating. And fixing that as an organization, I don't even know where to begin, but that's the thing that we're probably most focused on right now. It's just how houses get to people and how they're influenced by what they want to buy and what the options are for them. There's no easy solution to that, but in terms of what is it worth more, I'd say I can't really answer that necessarily, but certainly in that discussion you encounter all of the things that create value and worth, or that dictate value and worth in projects, and how do you challenge that to some extent is, I guess, the question that we're after right now.
Yeah, I just want to build on that, just because I think the right question is, does design add value? Yes. The question is, what is the appropriate way to harness that value, right? Because the one way to do it is the kind of crass real estate, I'm going to hire a star architect and I'm going to charge the most for it, and my value set is about money, and I'm going to use that to make money. Another way to do it, which is a little bit to what Rob's speaking, and it's what we focus on, is absorption and alignment around co-investing in something, which is, we would much rather sell out a project, have everybody feel like this is at or roughly at the same price as everything else, but it is so much nicer, and I believe it is worth more. I get to buy it at this number that everything else, which is completely commodity, lowest common denominator oriented product, is. And I'm excited to close. I'm eager about it. Maybe I won't call back so much to complain about the whatever toilet problem. And that's an alignment, right? That is a better way to harness the value, but it definitively adds value.
I think having been on both sides of the table, and having worked on a project that it's bottom line driven, and how fast you build dictates how much money you make. And that project was $600 million. The architecture team that we work with 3 firms, became more of a service provider than actual designers to ensure that the project is churned out, being sold at the right time at the market, and at the price that we set in order to hit our pro forma. And what I want to emphasize is design is extremely important, that as architects or developers even, it is our responsibility to ensure whatever we churn out and build and design is actually design driven and not just as a commodity for development. That's haven't seen that happen.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yep. Mr. Colin Booth.
Hey, Colin from Place Taylor. First of all, big fans of the whole panel, so great curation. Great to have you. So architects have different approaches than developers to looking forward to economic downturns. I'm wondering if you and how you are planning for what we're all sort of waiting for at this point.
I could answer that basically. In our model, we try to defer closing on properties as long as possible. So we've got 4 things that are working their way through the design and permitting pipeline right now. Only one of which one property actually we currently own. And once again, we're kind of working with the property owners, they're stakeholders in this, and there's a give and take. The take from them is that we won't begin the project till the timing's right. So I think things are looking a little squirrely right now in Seattle, and frankly, I pay a salary to myself from the architecture firm just like every other employee, and I basically live on my salary as an architect, and basically take any money I've made in development and generally reinvest that into the next project. So I'm happy to sit on the sidelines because timing is everything. So I feel like I'd be in a good position if I can sit on the sidelines, ride out any potential downturn, have good timing so that I can basically have some new units on the market when it starts at an uptick, and try to get involved in that entire wave. This wave the last 5 or 6 years, and you start just when it starts turning up, you're breaking ground and you're already midway through the cycle. And if you try to do 1 or 2 more projects, you could find your way into the downside of the cycle. So basically I use my income as an architect to ride through.
So I think on the development model side, there are more like fee development models where people are doing a lot of work and they're making money on the development fees, not in the return of the investment of the project. And they suffer the same risk that an architectural service provider does, which is when those projects stop, those fees stop, and then they're left with a struggle relative to the overhead that they have and how to just bring in money. The flip side of that is candidly about, and it's what our business model is, and it's intentional, which is recognizing there might be a year or 2 where we don't do anything and we don't have a return, and that requires not treating each project as a discrete project where at the end you're distributing everything and then you have nothing, but actually saving and building a company that can survive a period of time where nothing happens. And I credit my partner Catherine with that acumen early on in our career, and we similarly went through the Leung recession and had a project where we made $100,000 on a $25 million project, and it was like a tremendous victory in the middle of a recession. And that's a good thing to have happened early in our careers, and has set us up to a place where we're just kind of prudent, because the projects take so long, you can't possibly time it correctly. It's just not possible. They're 3, 4, 5. The project we're working in downtown Brooklyn, and we've been at it for 2015, 3.5 years, and we've got another 8 years to go. So what's going to happen in the market? I have no idea, right? So I think that's a smarter way of going about the development model, which is just recognizing that there might be a high time where you got 3 projects going on at once and the market's really hot and you're making, quote, a lot of money. There's going to be a time that is within the next 10 years where the complete opposite is happening and you can do nothing, and so you should be prepared for that.
I think if you're building luxury homes, condos, and Class A buildings, you might be in trouble. But in affordable housing, we don't really have a downturn. And also, you should see it as an opportunity to buy when the market is down, like a stock market. So save up as much cash as you can when a downturn hits, then you buy land.
I don't know, for us it's a little bit different. It's not a lot of what we do, but I mean, in terms of the housing or whatever we're developing, there's always the sort of what happens if things fall apart mode, and in housing it's pretty simple. You go to a rental model, you can do something with it. We try to make sure we're not too deep in from a financial perspective on anything that we're working on, and but also to kind of restate a point that I made earlier, that we're just not structured as developers, and by that I mean that we have to churn work through the office to deal with overhead and all the other stuff. We're not set up to say, here we're going to see a return in 2 years and we can kind of drive through and make it over that period of time. We're just not. And so we basically just live off of the way the professional services work, but use that as a facilitator for these other initiatives. So.
But I think this also touches on your comments of absorption, and one reason that you want the absorption so high is in the event that a recession is going to happen, you don't even know. Like to just get out of a project, it's got to feel great. Like when it's all closed up and done. Next question, yes.
Yeah, I have a question for AJ. I think other presentations touched on how they started the firm, and I was curious how it started from.
So, like everything else, it's mostly like luck and following, personal drive around what you think a plan is. I went to architecture school to make buildings. I was disillusioned pretty early on and feeling like, oh, this is a service profession, this sucks. And wanted to get on the other side. I happened to be at a school that had a real estate program. I took a certificate program with them. And I got back on like, yeah, architecture development, that's a thing. It was kind of a thing, but not really a thing 15 years ago. Through a mutual friend, I met my partner, Jared. He had a client who was a high net worth individual, and they had found a site that they were going to buy, and it was his first attempt at like, let's do development. And so I came on, and we formed the company shortly thereafter, and just kind of made it up as we went. It was, again, a lot of luck to have a partner that shared a value set, and a lot of luck to have a third partner who was a high net worth individual who had some money to invest. And, for the first 4 years or so, we really fought our way through the first project, which happened during the recession, and, figured out what the principles of the company were and what it was about. And, it only took the one built project to point at to then let the entire New York City real estate community be like, oh yeah, you're a real estate developer. Like, there's a building. So we somehow qualified really quickly. And then it was just about doing the same thing and being smarter about it and growing the scale of the project, because in the city you can do that, and it's kind of the same thing.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I'm sure you already know about this. It's a hot topic, opportunity zone, high net worth, affordable housing, different areas that diverses all the topics. I'd like to ask, how do you anticipate that impacting the way you practice? And also, do you think that's a way for our architect part of people to mobilize and go to those areas and start advocating for community and social causes using the toolkit we have at development?
Opportunity zone is a huge thing right now that we're looking into in terms of targeting the funding and also the development project structure. So that's definitely something that I would look into at this point. It is one of the tools to help in terms of development for housing, but not all of it. I think for an investor perspective, they got to write off the taxes for every 2 years, almost 2 years. And it's still being shaped at this point before it becomes something extremely concrete. So they're still working on that. But that's definitely something to look into. And as architects, ultimately you have to do something you love. That's what I believe in. So if your heart lies with creating projects for the community or creating opportunity for people, find ways to go into that. Because the other spectrum is you work for whoever or have clients or whatever that you don't enjoy designing for. So definitely find something you love.
I would just say it's like one of about 7,000 criteria for whether to do a project or not. Like, there's so many different things to consider, and that is a compelling from a capital gain standpoint, completely untested and unknowable possibility in certain districts, in certain places. But then there's again, so many other things, right? What's the development potential, and do I know the place, and am I excited about what it could be, and who does it benefit, and right, can I buy it, and can I build it, and there's that process of being disciplined about what your development objective is, to say no to things versus to be like, opportunity zones, yay, and forget all of the other 17 things you need to know is correct in order to make the commitment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it's a question here. I feel like I have a conversation about this once a week. Somebody calls and says they want to talk to me about opportunity zone stuff, and it's just, the fascinating thing to me is that it's so ephemeral and everyone thinks it's going to save the day and nobody knows what it is at the same time. And so it's kind of fun to ride that out and just listen to what people, as they bring it up, like what they find compelling about it exactly. But at the same time, we are in serious conversations with people that are looking at inventive funding to actually facilitate projects, and Louisville is an example where we're trying to bend it in some way that might make something happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. So it's at least in theory, it's a potential source out there that we'll see what time will tell if it actually turns into anything. But again, it's what I usually hear is what you said. It's like, it's amazing. It's going to change the world. It's going to change everything we're doing, but nobody knows how and why and when, and it's so much uncertainty around it. So. But we'll see. Yeah.
I think also in Seattle, it seems like the opportunity zones are kind of aligned with these neighborhoods that are most susceptible to gentrification and displacement. So it could be an opportunity as a developer or an investment opportunity, but it can really endanger the existing community that the opportunity is supposed to be investing in. So I think we're a little bit susceptible to really what the end result of this could be, at least in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So to piggyback for all the knowledge that you shared, aspiring developers, realtor. To piggyback on opportunity zone, I think one of the things that we're going to see driving that is the opportunity about that. For example, there's a provision in there that allows you to write off the gain of property for the 5, 7, 10 years. So here, what I find interested, as you mentioned, looking at areas of affordable housing. As far as shopping for developers and investors, competition is so fierce here, and we're kind of running out of space. So investors don't have any low-hanging fruits to pick from. What do you think would drive? What do you think is a good driver or a good indicator for someone to identify areas of growth? Like, we're always taught to stay away from ethnic neighborhoods and try to find, the average neighborhood next to a good neighborhood. But all that's left really are the areas that's been neglected. Homelessness, poverty. So, as someone like myself who's looking to get into development, should I aim for those areas, or should I avoid it if that's all that's left?
I like to answer because I spent a lot of time on what you're talking about. And then also in response to opportunities, and I think one of the issue with that is education toward the investors. We're started with my old firm, we're starting a fund that focuses on that part of the challenge is like education toward investors, what that means for the tax write-off eventually. I think for that, there are a lot of challenging neighborhoods that needs help, and affordable housing, a lot of it is heavily subsidized, about 80% subsidized, if we're lucky, by public subsidies. And so I think one thing if you're to get into affordable housing is to learn how to get the necessary funding from different places. The traditional investor is not easily going to afford or easily going to invest in affordable housing because the returns generally are lower. But because it's an extremely stable asset class, the matrix that you look at is not going to be the same as normal investment that they look at. The return will be lower, longer hold, cash flow. There's an exit strategy after 7 or 15 years. So if you're really interested in that, and because affordable housing, traditional affordable housing is very complex in terms of financing structure and takes a lot of time, I would start learning what cities and counties and state have what money. Part of our job is always talking to politicians and pulling measure funding from the cities and counties general fund to subsidize some of our projects. So I think definitely working with the public sector and figure out where the money comes from on the public side is very important. In addition to working with investors, institutional private equity foundation that is okay with a lower return. Our return threshold is between 4 to 6% compared to teens or 20s, but because it's so stable that some people are willing to take that on. So it's just a matter of finding the right folks.
Right, I think we have time for one more question. All all over the back.
I actually wonder how much money do you think it's necessary to launch a small but sustainable, practice, and what could be the core stages of development according to you?
So I would think about how much money you need to live on for 3 years. Then I would build a pro forma. I would build a pro forma that generates that much money for you in fees. And then I would figure out how much equity you need. And I would call everybody in this room's aunt and uncle and try to raise the equity in order to do the first project. And I would back calculate based on what you need to survive. Because if you had $10 million, you could start. If you had $5 million, you could start. If you had $80,000, you could start. So it's really about what you personally need in order to sustain the first project where presumably you're successful, and then you do the next one. Which is kind of the same answer to your question about, from a more personal, less institutional standpoint, like where would you go and live? And if there's an obvious answer to you, that is affordable and transitioning or more marginal, or maybe not, maybe just someplace that people haven't lived before but makes sense to you, do that, right? Like invest in that instinct, because the risk is not following that belief, right? Not in, I don't know, some like institutional development plan risk. It's about listening to yourself.
All right, I want to thank all of our speakers for coming from all around the nation, and hope you guys have a great night.